Hi, you're on the Nomad of Dreams channel. Today I'll talk about Robert Solomon's philosophy, about how thinking about feelings can restructure everyday life. I'll explain the central ideas that emotions structure meaning, that love and passion are practices, and that Stoicism is a technique of character. This matters because Solomon's philosophy translates abstract reasoning into tools for working on yourself and your relationships. Where are you listening from now, and what time is it for you? Write in the comments. I like seeing the map of listeners and sensing the difference in rhythms. Take a deep breath, level your shoulders, feel the rhythm of your breathing for at least a few seconds before continuing. The gist. Solomon is a thinker who puts emotions at the center of philosophical analysis. His approach looks at feelings as ways of evaluating the world and building values. It's the idea that experiences don't just happen to us, they make the world meaningful for us. I'll explain why such a shift constitutes a method of practical philosophy, and why his ideas work in everyday life. And then I'll move to the first theme that will support everything that follows. His thinking is typical in that it treats emotions as evaluations, as judgments rich with meaning that present value forms to the world. Love, jealousy, anger, joy. These states carry judgments about what is important, good, or bad for the person experiencing them. Roughly speaking, an emotion indicates how a person sees their world and their place in it. This turns feelings into a subject of ethics. If emotions express judgments, then they can be worked on, critically examined, and improved. This way of thinking works because it connects three layers of experience that are vital for practical philosophy. The first layer is the inner. Emotions turn out to be a linking element between desires, thoughts, and actions. The second layer is behavioral. Habits of feeling shape character and the predictability of actions. The third layer is social. Emotions live in language, in rituals, and in shared norms that give them form and make them usable for living together. Seeing emotions as evaluations opens resources for moral work, both individual and collective. This perspective bets on practice. Solomon's philosophy does not remain an abstract school of interpretation. It offers techniques and habits that change emotional life. The idea of Stoicism as a set of practices for self-care of feelings turns discipline into a craft of character. The skill of loving becomes communication and training, not a mystery dependent only on inspiration. This practical orientation explains why the ideas remain relevant. They are useful in real choice situations when you have to manage feelings, make decisions, and repair relationships. The next step in the discussion is to hold on to the thought that an emotion itself carries a substantive judgment. This is not a metaphor, but an analytical position. What you experience reveals an evaluation of the situation, people, and your own desires. Anger speaks of boundaries. Joy marks the presence of value. Fear signals a perceived threat. The differences between these states matter not only for psychology, but also for ethics, because they set criteria for responsibility. When an emotion formulates an evaluation, it becomes the material you can work with, discuss, question, develop. This concept has several practical consequences that are important for life. First, the ability to distinguish what judgment a particular feeling carries makes it clearer to understand the reasons for your actions and thus bear responsibility for them. Second, conscious work with emotions turns them into virtue. The habit of feeling in a particular way forms as a characteristic response to life situations. Third, the language we use to describe emotions affects their structure. Words and metaphors help shape feelings and direct their development. Talking about these things sounds not like instruction, but as an invitation to practice, to regularly attend to how you feel and what that means for your life. The limit of this approach is visible in a cautious attitude toward automatic interpretations. Emotions evaluate, but evaluations are subject to verification. Feelings can be sincere and at the same time mistaken in content. They require critique and dialogue. Solomon proposes mechanisms of self-correction, speech, habits, and social practices, the tools that allow editing emotional judgments and making them more constructive. This frees emotions from the role of random flashes and turns them into part of moral technique. An important aspect of such philosophical practice is the connection between the particularity of experience and the broad meanings of life. An emotion that arises in a specific situation can serve as a seed for a long-term life project. Passion, for example, names not only a short-lived experience, but also an orienting marker for sustained activity. Love appears as a persistent form of evaluation that is preserved and developed through word and deed. Understanding emotions as evaluations allows you to see how individual sensory reactions assemble into a way of life. I will go on to explain how this works with concrete examples and small thought exercises. But for now, it's important to leave one stable idea. Emotions are evaluative judgments. They shape meaning and the value of experience. This idea will be the starting point for everything that comes next, since it underpins the explanations of love, habits, Stoicism, and moral responsibility that will be unfolded in subsequent discussions. Emotions are evaluative judgments that assign events, people, and actions the status of being significant. They are not random biological reactions without meaning. Each experience invests the world with an assessment of what matters to you, what deserves attention, and how one should act. When you feel that something is important, that feeling is already passing judgment about value. And that judgment forms the map of priorities by which you live. This clarification begins with the understanding that an evaluative judgment is not always articulated in words. It can exist in bodily tone, in an image, and in a pull toward action. Nevertheless, such a judgment has content. It indicates what should be given weight, which relationships to maintain, and which boundaries to set. The sensation of anxiety carries an evaluation of a possible threat and the demand for vigilance. Joy highlights the presence of value and the desire to draw closer. Anger asserts that expected conditions of fairness have been violated. These evaluations direct attention, set criteria for will, and open the way for subsequent deliberation. Emotions thereby perform the role of recognizing significance in the world, turning a stream of stimuli into a field of values. The semantic load of an emotional judgment becomes stable through repetition and social articulation. The habit of experiencing a certain emotion in typical situations consolidates the corresponding evaluation as part of character. Language and the rituals of society form shared templates of evaluation. Words, metaphors, and habitual explanations give feelings a distinct shape and make them jointly accessible. Through conversation, through explanation, and through behavioral practices, individual emotional judgments grow into systems of values, into collective expectations, and into rules of interaction. Thus, emotions constitute not only personal and situational significance, but also long-term value structures that govern choice and meaning-making. The boundary of this idea runs through the nature of the emotional judgments themselves. The evaluation expressed in a feeling does not equal final truth about the world, and does not replace analytic reflection. A feeling indicates what matters to you, but it remains an open question whether this importance is justified in light of facts and connections. Furthermore, emotions are rooted in bodily experience and culture, so they can be distorted by habits, upbringing, and social norms. To acknowledge the evaluative power of emotions is also to acknowledge the need to critique those evaluations, verbalize them, and test them in dialogue. Control and reworking of emotional judgments happen through the practice of speech, through changing habits, and through corrective interactions with other people. The connection with Robert Solomon's work has been largely determinative for this approach.
Robert Solomon consistently showed that emotions have content that can be analyzed and worked with.
In his argument, emotions are not merely passive phenomena, but active forms of evaluation woven into moral life and into the practice of character. Solomon emphasized that changing an emotional pattern requires practice and communication, not just abstract arguments. So ethical work includes training feelings and changing the language with which we describe them. For Robert Solomon, this meant redirecting philosophy from abstract disputes toward a discipline of habits and speech, through which evaluative judgments become more tempered. I note that accepting emotions as judgments opens a concrete line of practical self-work. Then you start not only to describe feelings, but to try to understand their content, check the grounds of the evaluation, and learn to form new emotional habits. Robert Solomon helps to see that this requires both personal discipline and social forms that support new ways of evaluation. It is precisely this perspective that will serve as a foundation for further conversations about love, virtue, and how emotions themselves become instruments of meaning in your life. Speaking about love, it's first important to note that love is not only a feeling, but also a system of evaluations. It chooses whom and in which qualities to value, which intentions to consider significant, which limits to deem acceptable. Love makes some people and events noticeable and leaves others in the background, thus constituting a field of care.
Therefore, moral work here is twofold. On one hand, you must be able to discern which objects truly deserve trust and closeness. On the other hand, you must not allow biased habits to turn particular preferences into dogmas that close off space for growth. Virtue in this perspective appears as a stable emotional judgment, a habit of responding with respect, mercy, courage, where others incline toward alienation, fear, or laziness. The distinctive feature of virtue is the ability to maintain an evaluation in contact with reality. It does not turn into fanatic attachment, but preserves a steady orientation of attention toward value. Such tempering happens through practice in which emotions are gently guided by word, behavior, and social confirmation. Practical steps to transform emotional judgments are simple and accessible. The first is verbal articulation. Give the feeling a name and describe the evaluation it assigns. I'm hurt because I perceive the rejection as underappreciation. This reduces automatism and opens space for doubt and revision. The second is fact-checking. Compare the initial evaluation with the actual circumstances. Ask yourself which data support or refute the assumption. The third is experimentation. Temporarily adopt a different emotional assumption and see how behavior and relationships change. Such micro-practices are not abstract exercises, but training for the muscles of character. Social forms are crucial. The language of the family, school, workplace, and cultural rituals set templates by which emotions acquire meaning. When groups encourage reflection on feelings rather than punishment for their expression, an environment arises where emotional judgments are subjected to verification and refinement. Conversations, stories, shared rituals, and public examples serve as a framework for forming moral habits. Through them, evaluative judgments move from personal impulse to collective meaning. Finally, remember patience and compassion for yourself. Reconfiguring emotional patterns can be painful. Old habits return, mistakes happen, relationships are tested. The practice of self-forgiveness and readiness for new attempts is important, as is the ability to ask for help from friends, mentors, or professionals. Working with emotions as substantive judgments does not turn us into unfeeling analysts. On the contrary, we learn to be more sincere, responsible, and creative in our evaluations. This is the moral work Solomon proposed: to cultivate feelings together with thought, so they become reliable guides of meaning. The problem is that love is too often perceived as a sudden, mystical experience that cannot be taught or verified. Such a belief leaves people without tools to tend relationships, makes feelings dependent on chance, and amplifies expectations that reality cannot sustain. As a result, both relationships and personalities suffer. Resentment grows, habitual reactions consolidate, and the capacity to change weakens. Robert Solomon drew attention to the fact that this cluster of ideas disempowers love, turning it into an episode rather than a skill that requires attention and practice. The criterion of mature love as a skill can be described through a set of practices and signs. I'll formulate them briefly. Open speech about needs and boundaries. A habit of repair after conflicts. Regular shared activity. The ability to keep attention on the other in small things. And the capacity to revise one's assumptions about a partner. These signs work as measures. If conversations recur around the same accusation without an attempt to understand the cause, the skill is underdeveloped. If periodic rituals of care exist and both parties sustain them, the skill strengthens. Robert Solomon proposed looking not at declarations but at steady practices. By them, you can see what people are truly learning as a couple. When a couple regularly verbalizes their feelings and rules of interaction, this transforms emotional reactions into skills. A short observation. When people, after an argument, sit down and discuss what happened, and do this not once but consistently, their behavior changes more than after a single, deeply emotional conversation. Such a sequence of actions strengthens trust because the expectation of mutual attention becomes a habit, and habit forms character. Why this works and what consequences it has for your life? The skill of loving turns emotions from random signals into predictable resources. Random reactions shift attention to places where numbness or overreaction dictate behavior. Skill presupposes the ability to see the onset of a reaction and have a set of responses. Name it, ask, place a pause, offer repair. From an ethical perspective, the ability to love expands autonomy. Your decisions about attachment become conscious rather than the result of impulse. Robert Solomon believed that it is precisely through practices of speech and behavior that emotions turn into moral orienting points capable of shaping character. The gardener image helps to see the meaning. One who tends a plant does more than occasionally water it in a spurt of pity. He checks the soil, prunes, watches the wind and the light, changes the pot as it grows. Love as a skill is care for a relationship in small things and continual decisions. The significance of that care goes beyond private experiences. It affects what your character will be, what habits you'll pass on to children, what models of interaction will become normal in your circle.
This perspective was revealed by Robert Solomon, emphasizing the responsibility for forming emotional practices. The consequences of lacking the skill are obvious. Relationships turn into a field of expectations, where every protest is taken as a sentence and every misunderstanding as proof of mismatch. At the personal level, this means the development of defensive strategies, closure of access to vulnerability, and intensification of projections. At the social level, such a habitual model reproduces patterns where love is displayed as bright but rare flashes, and steady duties are seen as a burden. When skills exist, relationships foster growth. When they don't, relationships more often become sources of pain and self-assertion through control and manipulation. The boundary of applying the idea of love as a skill is also clear. Skills have limits in situations where serious power imbalances, traumas, and mental conditions intervene that require professional help. A skill does not guarantee the eternity of feelings and does not make relationships immune to loss. It improves the conditions of interaction, but does not cancel life's randomness and the inevitability of grief. Robert Solomon stressed that philosophical therapy of feeling habits is not a panacea. It is a method for improving quality of life that requires honesty, time, and understanding of limits. For you, this means a concrete choice of actions, not a magic formula. You can start with a simple agreement about how you will discuss hurts, and with the practice of short, regular conversations about what brings joy. It's important to remember that learning to love resembles training. It requires repetition, patience, and the readiness to ruin the first exercise before a skill appears. Acknowledging this path and the working conditions for it is the central idea that Robert Solomon embedded in his understanding of moral life. Practice begins small. Agree on a short weekly conversation where you discuss observations about feelings and needs rather than accusations. Use I statements instead of you rebukes. I feel. It's important to me. Try to ask back to ensure accurate understanding. Make a rule of pause. If an emotion is too strong, note it and return to the conversation in an hour or the next day. Introduce small rituals of repair. Simple actions that signal a desire for reconciliation. A cup of tea, a walk, a short note, and observe them regularly. It's useful to keep a personal diary of observations about reactions. In it, you record 3 causes of bitterness and 1 thing you're grateful to your partner for. This helps shift focus and see not only failures, but also steady manifestations of care. When old hurts recur, ask yourself, what need is hidden behind them, and how could you satisfy it differently? If there is trauma or a serious imbalance in the couple, involve a professional. The skill of loving grows faster with the support of an external perspective and technique. Don't expect perfection. The goal is not to eliminate conflict, but to develop a way to live with it and learn. Start today with a small step. Set aside 15 minutes to calmly talk about what's important to each of you, and agree on the first simple rule that you both will follow tomorrow, both in the morning. Stoicism, in Robert Solomon's view, appears as technique, a set of concrete exercises for managing attention, evaluations, and behavior. The mechanism is simple to describe and hard to perform. An emotion arises as a judgment about the world, and if you change the way you judge, the experience will change too.
Solomon returns attention to the fact that you can train not only body and mind, but also feeling through practice of thought and action. The mechanism works through three interrelated operations. The first is labeling the experience. Notice that the reaction is happening inside. Give it a name. The second is reframing, that is, reinterpreting the evaluation that produced the reaction. Question the automatic conclusion that accompanies fear or anger. The third is rehearsing a new habit of responding, repeating simple actions that consolidate the changed evaluation. These operations in sequence move the impulse into a manageable procedure. Attention fixes, thought reconstructs, the body and behavior consolidate the new form of response. Robert Solomon insisted that this is not theory, but craft. Craft requires tools, words, rituals, bodily exercises, and regular application. What this is needed for? In everyday life, emotions perform diagnostic and directive functions. They signal values and guide behavior. If these signals are left without technique, they often lead to impulsive decisions, self-sabotage, and the destruction of relationships. The Stoic method provides a way to turn these signals into resources. Anxiety becomes a warning for planning, anger an indicator of boundaries, sorrow a source of meaning and solidarity. Practically, this means more control over what you do under the influence of strong feelings, and more responsibility for how those actions affect others. Robert Solomon believed that in this way, a person strengthens autonomy and the moral capacity to choose whether to continue or stop acting in response to an experience. The mechanism brings concrete benefits under the conditions of the modern pace of life. Technologies amplify the flow of stimuli, political and social structures provoke collective emotions, and loneliness increases the propensity for rigid reactions. The skill of self-regulation reduces the likelihood that an emotion will seize and determine long-term plans. It creates a space of pause and reflection, in which one can measure short-term reactions against long-term values. This is not an abstract philosophical idea. It is a way of living in which choices become more consistent with who a person wants to be. Where the mechanism breaks. First, when the technique turns into pretense. If labeling an emotion and reappraisal are used superficially, without inner honesty, reappraisal becomes decoration, and the emotion is not changed. This happens when a person learns the right phrases and actions, but continues to avoid the hard work of changing deep-seated evaluations. Second, when the discipline of practice slides into self-coercion or self-flagellation. Then constant control turns into a constant feeling of guilt over every failure, and the technique ceases to serve freedom, becoming a new rigid standard. Robert Solomon warned of this danger, noting that moral discipline must leave space for acknowledging weakness and vulnerability. The third point of failure is related to the context of power relations and trauma. Self-regulation practices help little when the force exerted on you comes from structures you cannot shield yourself from, or when past traumas distort basic evaluations of the world. In such cases, attempts to rebuild judgments are powerless without external help, therapeutic support, changes in the environment, or real protection. A person can train in the technique and at the same time remain in a dangerous situation, where control over emotions does not solve the problem of injustice or violence. The fourth defect arises in moral blindness. The skill of regulating emotions is used to avoid noticing one's involvement in harm. If emotional discipline becomes a reason to remain inactive in the face of another's suffering, it stops being ethics and becomes a backdrop for self-protection. Here, the boundary between personal resilience and social responsibility is important. Robert Solomon emphasized that inner order must be nourished by outward attachment to others. Otherwise, it will be a dead technique. Where to restore the mechanism's effectiveness? First, through integration with emotional honesty, acknowledging fear, pain, and hurt without dramatization and without pretense. Second, through group practice and accountability. Discussing your exercises with close others or a mentor helps to distinguish genuine transformation from superficial rule following. It is also important to combine cognitive techniques with bodily and behavioral practices. Breathing, movement, and attention rituals consolidate changes better than thoughts alone. Finally, reality-based boundaries are necessary. When a situation requires external intervention, the technique of self-regulation does not substitute for actions to change conditions. The conclusion is simple. Stoicism, as Robert Solomon saw it, is a technology of feeling that requires both discipline and humanity. The mechanism of operation is clear: tracking, revaluation, rehearsal. And it is in this sequence that it brings freedom from automaticity. Space for vulnerability and for engagement with the world remains mandatory. If you want to try this technology, start small. Learn to notice one recurring impulse and apply a simple algorithm to it. Name it, ask, postpone action for a minute. Such a step already activates the mechanism and shows where it is robust and where it needs support. Robert Solomon presented Stoicism as a practical philosophy of life, a craft that makes feelings an instrument rather than a sentence. How do feelings become a stable part of character, a habit you carry with you, a tool rather than a random impulse? Emotional virtue is not a set of rare enlightenments, but a way of arranging your life so that experiences find a stable form through practice and environment. Robert Solomon expresses this thought: feelings arise and become fixed at moments of repetition, through language, through actions, and through the social frameworks in which you live. An emotion, in essence, becomes a virtue when its experience is regularly accompanied by a certain attention and a certain response that repeat until automaticity, while remaining filled with meaning. The key turn here is not to look for a ready-made virtue inside yourself, but to build it from the outside, through practice. Speech, gestures, rituals, daily habits shape emotion as a skill. If each morning you tie a specific action to gratitude, this act over time ceases to be arbitrary and turns into a stable emotional stance. Robert Solomon emphasized that personality is created in the density of repeating practices. The point is that habits embryonically form feeling, and language gives that feeling meaning. The mechanism can be described by a simple scheme. Repetition forms bodily and mental neural structure. Language fixes the appraisal and directs attention. Social feedback strengthens or weakens the pattern. The reason for formation is the regular inclusion of attention and intention in the experience. The device is a chain of actions: noticing, verbal labeling, action in the world, discussion with others. The consequences are the stability of the emotional reaction, its ability to transfer to new situations, and its capacity to serve as an anchoring choice. In Robert Solomon's work, this combination of practice, speech, and social life is the heart of emotional ethics. A short, everyday illustration. An hour of weekly listening without interruption and without advice gradually changes your reaction to another's pain and makes compassion a natural form of response. Deeper. Forming feelings requires an environment that supports new patterns. An environment with habits supports changes better than isolation. Language has the power to fix a new appraisal. When you voice your anxiety as a signal of care for the future, that act of speech rearranges its role in action. A group and social practices provide feedback, make changes visible, and protect against regression. Robert Solomon noted that feelings exist in a dense space of norms and expectations. Changing a personal emotional technique often requires reshaping communication with those around you. There are important signs of genuine emotional virtue in practice. The first sign is transferability. The new habit appears not only in one situation, but across a range of contexts. The second is embodied coherence. The response is accompanied by changes in breathing, posture, behavior, not only words. The third is motivational coherence. The habit leads to actions aligned with long-term values, not remaining only in the zone of inner sympathy. Check the signs to distinguish a contrived manner from a sustainable virtue. Robert Solomon recommended paying attention specifically to such practical competence as the criterion of true transformation. The limits of forming emotions through practice are real and clear. Severe trauma, structural abuse of power, and constant threat destroy the conditions in which habits can take root. Sometimes attempts to cultivate a feeling prove powerless against external pressure and require parallel changes in the world around. Plus, moral responsibility demands that the art of shaping feelings does not become a way to evade real obligations to others. True emotional virtue grows in the combination of inner discipline and openness to the world. And in Robert Solomon's work, this combination is always presented as a practical attachment to others, not as a secluded project of self-improvement. If you try, keep three things in view: regularity of actions, support from your environment, and alignment with real obligations. Emotions become virtues when they are repeated, given language, and live in society. Robert Solomon saw in this a path for an ethics that does not remain an abstraction, but becomes a way of living, where feelings function as tools for choice, connection, and responsibility. How do feelings become a stable part of character, a habit you carry with you, a tool rather than a random impulse? Emotional virtue is not a set of rare enlightenments, but a way of arranging your life so that experiences find a stable form through practice and environment. Robert Solomon expresses this thought: feelings arise and become fixed at moments of repetition, through language, through actions, and through the social frameworks in which you live. An emotion, in essence, becomes a virtue when its experience is regularly accompanied by a certain attention and a certain response that repeat until automaticity, while remaining filled with meaning. The key turn here is not to look for a ready-made virtue inside yourself, but to build it from the outside, through practice. Speech, gestures, rituals, daily habits shape emotion as a skill. If each morning you tie a specific action to gratitude, this act over time ceases to be arbitrary and turns into a stable emotional stance. Robert Solomon emphasized that personality is created in the density of repeating practices. The point is that habits embryonically form feeling, and language gives that feeling meaning. The mechanism can be described by a simple scheme. Repetition forms bodily and mental neural structure. Language fixes the appraisal and directs attention. Social feedback strengthens or weakens the pattern. The reason for formation is the regular inclusion of attention and intention in the experience. The device is a chain of actions: noticing, verbal labeling, action in the world, discussion with others. The consequences are the stability of the emotional reaction, its ability to transfer to new situations, and its capacity to serve as an anchor in choice. In Robert Solomon's work, this combination of practice, speech, and social life is the heart of emotional ethics. A short, everyday illustration. An hour of weekly listening without interruption and without advice
gradually changes your reaction to another's pain and makes compassion a natural form of response. Deeper. Forming feelings requires an environment that supports new patterns. An environment with habits supports changes better than isolation. Language has the power to fix a new appraisal. When you voice your anxiety as a signal of care for the future, that act of speech rearranges its role in action. And group and social practices provide feedback, make changes visible, and protect against regression. Robert Solomon noted that feelings exist in a dense space of norms and expectations. Changing a personal emotional technique often requires reshaping communication with those around you. There are important signs of genuine emotional virtue in practice. The first sign is transferability. The new habit appears not only in one situation, but across a range of contexts. The second is embodied coherence. The response is accompanied by changes in breathing, posture, behavior, not only words. The third is motivational coherence. The habit leads to actions aligned with long-term values, not remaining only in the zone of inner sympathy. Check these signs to distinguish a contrived manner from a sustainable virtue. Robert Solomon recommended paying attention specifically to such practical competence as the criterion of true transformation. The limits of forming emotions through practice are real and clear. Severe trauma, structural abuse of power, and constant threat destroy the conditions in which habits can take root. Sometimes, attempts to cultivate a feeling prove powerless against external pressure and require parallel changes in the world around. Plus, moral responsibility demands that the art of shaping feelings does not become a way to evade real obligations to others. True emotional virtue grows in the combination of inner discipline and openness to the world. And in Robert Solomon's work, this combination is always presented as a practical attachment to others, not as a secluded project of self-improvement. If you try, keep three things in view: regularity of actions, support from your environment, and alignment with real obligations. Emotions become virtues when they are repeated, given language, and live in society. Robert Solomon saw in this a path for an ethics that does not remain an abstraction, but becomes a way of living where feelings function as tools for choice, connection, and responsibility. Practically, this means a few obvious steps. First, designate the emotion you want to cultivate in simple words and tie it to a concrete task. Compassion. Listen without advice for 20 minutes. Firmness. Say no in 3 situations per week. Second, create external reminders. Write the intention in a journal. Make an agreement with a partner. Put notes in your calendar. Third, measure and reflect. After each exercise, note what happened in your body, how your perspective changed, and what actions followed. Fourth, seek social practice, groups, friends, mentors who will support and correct the process. It is important to remember honesty. Forming an emotion does not eliminate the need for reflection and critique. Sometimes, what seems like virtue serves as cover for selfish motives. It is important periodically to ask yourself whose interests this feeling protects, and to change the practice if necessary. Finally, patience. Lasting changes take time, but even small daily steps accumulate, and over time stop requiring willpower. Thus, emotional virtue is not magic, but a craft. Attention, language, and social environment are the tools that, working together, turn one-off experiences into stable forms of character. And in this process, there is no contradiction between personal practice and care for the world. By strengthening virtues in yourself, you simultaneously change the environment in which they can continue to live. It is long work, but it makes you dependable and changes your relation to life peacefully.
A consequence of the visible and little conscious order of emotions in society is that your feelings never live alone. They become embedded in a network of expectations, customs, and rules that give experience form, direction, and scale. When an emotion receives a social frame, it ceases to be only an internal signal and becomes a means of coordinating behavior, a means of communicating values, and a way to sustain or change collective order. That is why habitual manners of grieving, rejoicing, angering, loving arise. They are replicated in speech, in gestures, in rituals, and this makes them stable and predictable. This consequence endows emotions with political and moral power. They set the tone in groups, form trust between people, and make joint activity possible. Through emotions, collectives determine who is considered a hero and who a traitor. Through emotions, boundaries of closeness and estrangement are maintained. Through emotions, a moral space is formed in which decisions are made. You feel this every time you react quickly and almost automatically to someone's pain or compliment, because the reaction is already embedded in the language and practices that surround you. The reason for such embeddedness is that an emotion by its nature is an evaluative judgment. An evaluation is always directed by language and norms. An emotion declares a value or a threat, and society instantly begins to interpret this signal through familiar categories. People learn to recognize and reproduce the same appraisals through upbringing, institutions, art, and daily interaction. Not only individual emotional states become understandable, but also how they should be expressed, when, before whom, and in what form. Language gives emotions content, and social practice fixes forms of expression so that they fit into scripts of relationships and roles. The structure of this process is multifaceted. First, rituals and rules create templates of expression. Second, others' behavior serves as immediate feedback. An expression is accepted, encouraged, or corrected. Third, narratives and collective remembering form a communal memory that makes some feelings legitimate and others rare. Fourth, everyday roles suggest which emotions are expected from those who occupy a given position in the group. These mechanisms work together and are reinforced by bodily habits. Gestures, facial expressions, and breathing rhythms become part of the social language of feeling, transmitted without words. A clarification is needed regarding personal responsibility in such a social context. The social nature of emotions does not absolve you of responsibility for what you feel and how you act under the influence of that feeling. On the contrary, knowing that emotions are formed and fixed externally gives you tools for conscious work with them. Responsibility manifests in the ability to recognize normative expectations, assess their benefit and harm in a concrete situation, and then choose forms of feeling and expression that align with the obligations you actually want to bear. Emotional habits imposed by the environment can be acknowledged, accepted, or changed in light of the obligations you truly wish to assume. One must keep in mind the limits of this adjustment. Social practices can be so dense that an individual finds it difficult to change a layer of behavior without environmental support. The environment fixes not only forms, but also the consequences of deviations: punishments, stigma, loss of trust. Therefore, intervention in emotional culture requires not only inner effort, but practices of collective alignment, discussions, rituals, public changes of language. Here, the political side of feelings manifests. Emotions can be an instrument for both strengthening justice and maintaining falsehoods and hierarchies. The role of language in this process deserves separate attention. Words,
metaphors, narratives give emotional states density and direction. When an experience has a word and a story, it becomes available for discussion, critique, and correction. The absence of language leaves the experience isolated and hard to manage. Language makes an emotion an object of moral attention. You can name your hurt, analyze its sources, agree with others, and transform it into responsibility or action. In this sense, the social nature of emotions both explains their power and shows the path to their transformation. The connection of this theme with the work of Robert Solomon is obvious and deep. Robert Solomon insisted that feelings are practices embedded in life with others, and that understanding emotions without accounting for social frames gives only half the picture. He showed how moral appraisals arise in dialogue and how words and rituals shape emotional reality. Solomon emphasized the role of institutions and everyday practices in the education of feelings, as well as the importance of public responsibility for how feelings are expressed in society. In Robert Solomon's work, you will find the idea that changing emotional culture requires both personal discipline and collective work. Solomon pointed out that the moral education of emotions requires a language, rules, and practices that people accept collectively. He proposed treating emotions as a bridge between individual experience and social life, and that this bridge is built with words, rituals, and habits. If you take emotions as social practices, you gain a tool both for understanding your reaction in a particular situation and for participating in changing shared norms. Robert Solomon offered not just analysis, but a practical perspective. Work with language, shape shared practices, and don't be afraid to discuss emotional expectations. It is precisely through such combined work of personal and collective feeling that a path to a more honest and responsible life together is found. One story can tell a lot about what I call passion as a life project. A person who returns to the same undertaking for decades builds a routine, a language, and a circle of people around it, through which that undertaking becomes part of their identity. At first, it looks like a strong attachment, a feeling that encourages and gives direction. Gradually, this attachment begins to structure days, decisions, and plans. Outwardly, it may seem that meaning appears by itself, but on the level of practice, it is clear that meaning is created through regular actions: walk, conversations about the matter, correcting mistakes, celebrating small achievements. Such steady movements make passion a reliable source of meaning. When you move from the particular case to the general, it becomes clear that passion is not simply an intense feeling. It is a form of organizing life, a way of forming a long-term project of values. Passion indicates that a person undertakes a commitment to continue, even when the first wave of pleasure fades. It includes the ability to build the infrastructure of activities: habits, rituals, reading, milieu, financial conditions. These elements mutually reinforce one another. Passion turns individual reactions and bursts into stable structures that make it possible to walk toward a long-term goal. Emotionally, passion always contains an evaluation. It signals that something matters, that this object or activity is worth giving time and energy to. But an evaluation grows into practice when it is accompanied by language. Discussing one's work with others, the terminology of the craft, stories about failures and discoveries make the experience available for reflection and transmission. Robert Solomon emphasized that emotions exist within practices, and passion as a practice needs words and rituals in order to persist. When a narrative arises around the project, it ceases to be only a personal feeling and becomes a social enterprise of meaning. It is important to consider the mechanism by which passion becomes a project. First, there is attraction, then a trial, and the initial efforts, after which repetition, and course correction follow. Repetition forms skills. Skills strengthen confidence, and confidence increases the willingness to invest further. This chain works as a self-sustaining system. Through it, passion finds a way to survive temporary failures and maintain motivation. The consequences of this mechanism are obvious. Life gains direction, professional competence develops, and the sense of control over one's fate arises. At the same time, the mechanism requires conditions, time, resources, and social ties, so as not to collapse into mere intensity without continuation. Passion as a project has a social side. It requires the recognition of others and is often fueled by their attention. Shared approval increases the willingness to continue the labor. Criticism and neglect reduce its resilience. Robert Solomon noted that emotions are interconnected with social practices, and passion is no exception. Others provide feedback, supply a place and language in rituals, and help build a professional or creative identity. It is through interaction with others that passion turns into a course of history, a history of craft, teaching, creation, or service. This general picture allows for practical advice, not as a directive, but as a guideline. For passion to become a project, you need to take care of 3 things. First, develop disciplines that make regular labor easier. Second, form a language to describe your goals and experiences. Third, seek an environment that shares or supports the project. Robert Solomon spoke about cultivating feelings and the importance of institutions in this process. Institutions, in a broad sense, clubs, workshops, academic communities, help channel passion and give it social support. The limitations of this approach are significant and cannot be ignored. Passion can turn into a yoke when the project consumes all spheres of life and leaves no space for other commitments. Immersion without reflection makes a person vulnerable to errors of evaluation when they ignore harm to health, relationships, or ethics for the sake of continuing the work. In addition, social conditions can change. What supported the passion before may disappear, and then the project will require reconstruction or closure. Here the boundary of passion's resilience appears. It is not an abstract force, but a practice tied to resources and social institutions. Another limit is connected with the inner mutability of values. People change, and what once gave meaning may cease to fit a new moral stance. Passion as a project does not guarantee the eternal rightness of a choice. One needs the ability to revise commitments and translate accumulated experience into other forms of life if necessary. Robert Solomon raised the theme of responsibility for one's feelings and their expression. Responsibility includes a readiness to assess whether a given passion supports the life you consider worthy. When you evaluate your own pursuits, it is useful to ask a simple question. Does this project serve the ends that are valuable to you over the long term? The answer should not be only an emotional surge. It is about a product of practice and reason, about connecting love for the matter with the ability to build it, and with honesty toward others. I remember discussing this in various texts and lectures, and I always return to the idea that passion requires discipline and language. Otherwise, it will remain only a moment. In sum, passion as a source of lasting meaning becomes intelligible when regarded as practice, rather than merely an internal state. Robert Solomon provided tools for such understanding. Speak about feelings, organize practices, build collective forms of support. You can apply this to your life by treating your strong inclinations as projects that deserve care but also require limits. Then passion ceases to be a random flash and becomes a stable way of living. Emotions function as practical rationality. The rule is simple. Every feeling carries an evaluation and suggests a way to act. It furnishes a basis for choice. An emotion indicates what is worthy of attention, what deserves effort. Fear signals threat. Joy shows the value of an activity. Pity suggests care. Robert Solomon insisted that emotions contain judgments, and therefore they can be the object of rational work, part of the decision-making process. Treating feelings as informative evaluations is a point of departure. This idea changes the habitual image of reason as a separate sphere. Emotions are not merely accompanying effects. They are interwoven with beliefs, prescriptions, and expectations. When you feel disgust, an attitude toward what causes the reaction is already embedded in it. When you love, hidden in love are conceptions of the other's value and of how to live. Robert Solomon emphasized that emotions can be analyzed by what objects and properties they highlight and what demands for action they make. Tension arises from the fact that feelings come with bodily force and a history of habits. The causes and structure of emotions can be described as follows. Cause: an evaluative attachment to a situation, usually operative and partly automatic. Structure: a combination of bodily activation, mental representations, and the narratives we store. Consequences: an emotion shapes attention, memory, and readiness to act, but it can also distort judgments if it rests on false premises or when it is replaced by social imitation. This explains why emotions simultaneously provide rational grounds and create errors. When anger flares up because of unexpected criticism, you can lash out or pause and ask what the feeling indicates. This way you can understand whether anger protects boundaries or functions as a replay of old hurts. Pausing for a couple of breaths, naming the emotion in words, asking what it values and what it demands. This is a simple way to test its advice. This example shows how practical rationality appears in small decisions. Difficulties also appear in the social dimension of feelings. Emotions are learned and consolidated through exchange and norms. Sometimes the collective mood makes individual experiences so habitual that they are taken as objective facts. Then the evaluative component gets stuck in routine, and special work is required to recognize its dependence on context. Robert Solomon spoke about the cultivation of feelings and the role of institutions, because it is through external structures that emotional life can be corrected and guided. Moving to practical resolution requires a set of disciplines. There are three main directions of practice. First, develop an attentive attitude toward your evaluations. Second, form languages and narratives through which emotions undergo a test of reasonableness. Third, build external conditions that support stable emotional habits. Each direction has its techniques and limitations, and together they create a field for the synthesis of reason and feeling. Mindfulness methods are simple and always applicable. Delay before acting under the influence of a strong feeling. Name the experience, describe its object, and ask what rule or value it proposes. Often it turns out that behind the emotion there is a need or an evaluation that can be expressed as a concrete demand. This practice reduces impulsivity and allows you to use the information an emotion gives without losing control. Work with language and narrative strengthens the critical side of emotions. Writing down experiences, discussing them with someone you trust, voicing arguments for and against a reaction helps reveal which judgments are hidden in the feeling.
Robert Solomon emphasizes that feelings become clearer when brought into speech and public scrutiny. Through conversation, emotions are tested, receive feedback, and cease to be semi-mythical signals. Structuring environment and habits makes emotional evaluations more reliable. Regular practices of rest, established work boundaries, communication rituals, and institutional support reduce the likelihood that emotions will dictate one-off decisions. Habits function as positive automatism. They allow feelings to provide an evaluation while the life system transforms it into consistent actions. Then, affective rationality operates within the framework of responsibility. The limits of application are clear. Emotions provide grounds for action, but these grounds have force only in the context of checkable premises and available resources. If a feeling is based on false beliefs or pathological regulation, its advice needs correction by a specialist. Sometimes a therapist's intervention is required, sometimes a change in social conditions or abandoning the practice that fuels erroneous evaluations. Accepting emotions as a source of rationality does not relieve one of the need for critique and control. The synthesis of reason and feeling becomes available through regular exercises, through developing language, and through institutional support. Robert Solomon offered tools for this work: analyzing the content of emotions, cultivating feelings through practices, and recognizing their social nature. If you begin to test emotional judgments, give them words, and place them within a structure of habits, feelings will start to serve not only as internal signals, but also as stable guides for action. This turns emotions into a reliable partner of reason and allows one to live more responsibly and fully. Language and metaphors shape emotional reality as both instrument and matrix. This is not an abstract idea. It is the descriptive power of words that directs attention, sets categories, and orients feelings before the body has time to express itself. Robert Solomon returned to this idea many times. Emotions gain meaning through narrative and metaphor, through how we name them and tell about them. A metaphor is not mere rhetorical ornament, but a cognitive mechanism. It transfers properties from one area of experience to another, and thereby attributes to an emotional experience a set of qualities and demands. When a particular experience is put into words, a script of behavior, a set of expectations, and a degree of seriousness are already embedded in it. This transfer works automatically. A linguistic form activates associations linked to it, generates an image of action, and excludes other possible readings. Thus, part of an emotion becomes an object of culture rather than merely a personal impulse. From this follows a simple conclusion. Naming changes the structure of experience. A word fixes the contours of a feeling and makes it fit for discussion and verification. In oral and written communication, an emotion ceases to be a purely bodily event and becomes an object one can work with. Robert Solomon emphasized that this translation into language is one of the main ways emotions become moral and practical. How exactly do metaphors act on emotions? First, they highlight aspects of experience and make them the center of attention. Then, they tie these aspects to familiar plots and evaluations. Finally, they set a temporal perspective. A metaphor can present an experience as a fleeting, exciting flash, or as a fundamental feature of fate. At each stage, there is a concrete logic of meaning transmission, and this logic is not neutral. It invests the feeling with causal expectational structures, norms, and roles. The development of this mechanism
is linked to the idea of emotions as evaluative judgments. Language provides the concepts with which evaluation operates: dignity, insult, duty, attachment, fidelity. Words connect social meanings and give emotions normative weight. What begins as physical activation is directly translated into moral claims and rights. A notable thought of Solomon's is that without language, emotions would hardly have acquired such institutional power. Through speech, they gain the ability to demand, justify, and criticize. The social measure is key here. In collective life, metaphors are fixed through repetition and through communication rituals. These repetitions turn accidental experiences into stable patterns of reaction that are then perceived as natural. Language acts as a link between individual sensation and social expectation. Robert Solomon pointed out that the cultivation of feelings proceeds through forming lexical habits and narratives that exert pressure on imagination and choices. There is also the reverse side of the structure. Language can open up flexibility. When new words and new metaphors enter the lexicon, familiar forms of experience dissolve and make room for other ways of feeling. This work of transforming emotional reality requires the practice of speech. Speaking aloud, discussing, writing, give the possibility to see what meanings are invested in an experience and what alternatives are available. The very act of introducing language changes possible trajectories of feeling. The limitations are also noticeable. Language does not replace the body and does not eliminate immediate physiological responses. A word can direct, clarify, give meaning, but it does not instantly cancel the sensation. Moreover, verbal metaphors carry their own distortions. They impose ready-made schemes on experience that do not always fit. Robert Solomon worked with this boundary, stressing the need for critical evaluation and practical testing of verbal forms. A word invites discussion, but discussion does not always occur. Then a metaphor fixes a pattern and makes it less mobile. The practical recommendation that follows from this idea is simple and tangible. Start naming your experiences and watch what stories and scripts that name brings. Pay attention to the stable metaphors in your speech and in the speech of those around you. Try to expand the vocabulary of feelings, introducing descriptions that offer more options for action and fewer stereotyped accusations. In this process, language becomes a tool for cultivating emotional flexibility. Formed metaphors work at the level of identity. When a person frequently articulates their state in a certain way, it becomes part of their autonomy and relationships. Language makes a feeling visible to others and to oneself, and in this act, responsibility appears. Robert Solomon believed that emotional honesty and responsibility are linked to the readiness to present one's experience in an intelligible form and to put it to the test. Speech becomes a means both of self-understanding and of moral assessment. Affixation. Language not only describes emotions, it constructs them. A metaphor sets the form of experience, prescribes lines of behavior, and connects social norms. Work on emotional life proceeds through the practice of speech, through expanding vocabulary, and through critical checking of the images you use. When you give a feeling a name, you change its landscape and open the way to new ways of living with it. Robert Solomon proposed treating speech as one of the main tools of the philosophical practice of emotions, and this remains a useful guide today. Emotional honesty means consciously accepting and accurately expressing your feelings so that they are understandable to you and others, and so that you are prepared to answer for the consequences of your words and actions.
This requirement includes several interrelated capacities: recognizing what you feel, being able to name the experience without blurring its meaning, the ability to explain where it might come from, and the willingness to act on the basis of that speech. These elements work as a single practice. Recognition is attention to bodily signals and to the mental comments that make up the experience. Naming gives structure. A word fixes boundaries and options for reacting. Explanation translates the feeling into a narrative that can be discussed. Responsibility shows itself when you consider how the expression will affect others and are ready to bear the moral and practical consequences of your words. The mechanics of this practice are gradual and trainable. The inner voice often rushes to judgment, but honesty does not require public expression in the first instant. First comes internal clarification. Ask yourself what exactly is activating in the body, what thoughts arise, which past scripts amplify the current response. Then choose a form of speech that preserves accuracy and respect. Speak briefly and directly. Check that the idea reached the interlocutor. Training turns random reactions into a stable habit of expressive precision. This ability has moral consequences. When you express a feeling clearly, it becomes an object of discussion rather than a hidden force that violates agreements. Honesty reduces the likelihood of manipulation and misunderstanding. It requires courage because a truthful word exposes your vulnerability and may surface contradictions within relationships. At the same time, honesty supports autonomy. You become the author of your own emotional story rather than a passive bearer of hidden impulses. What does this mean for close relationships and work? Sharing a feeling means offering others space for response, for shared meaning, and for the practice of correction. If you speak about pain, it is an invitation to care or to change behavior. If you speak about joy, it is a way to amplify overall motivation. In a professional context, honesty simplifies decision-making because emotions cease to act as unconscious factors and turn into information for collective analysis. In personal life, honesty builds trust that weathers tests, and in a public role, makes your positions transparent and verifiable. The boundaries and risks of emotional honesty are obvious and require attention. There are situations when full expression will cause harm or jeopardize safety, and then honesty is combined with restraint and care. Self-deception is also possible when words seem precise but mask automatic narratives you take for your own. Outbursts of affect can distort recognition. In such moments, it is better to postpone speech and put it into words later. Finally, honesty runs up against cultural norms. Some societies value directness, others the expression of feeling through action. In each case, you must consider the consequences, not simply present truth as an abstract duty. The reasons, structure, and consequences of such a practice can be described briefly. The reason: emotions guide behavior and demand meaning. The structure: a sequence of attention, naming, verbal articulation, and the readiness to be accountable. The consequences: increased mutual understanding, strengthened responsibility, but also the need for regulation skills and tact. This triad shows that honesty is a complex tool requiring discipline, not an automatic virtue that is sufficient to proclaim. Practical steps are simple and doable. Keep a small feelings journal where, without excuses, you write what you experienced and what words correspond to it. Before an important conversation, rehearse with yourself a few phrasings that convey accuracy without accusation. After expressing yourself, ask about the reaction and be ready to adjust your account if your speech was incomplete or misunderstood. Over time, this exercise has strengthened the ability to speak honestly and to answer for your words. Robert Solomon paid close attention to this topic,
treating emotions as acting forces that acquire moral status through practice. Robert Solomon emphasized that emotions are not merely internal states, they are tied to possibilities of choice and to responsibility for one's impact on others. Robert Solomon held that emotional honesty is not a mass gift, but a skill formed through storytelling and the discipline of self-reflection, and that philosophical practice helps build these habits. The conclusion is simple. Honesty in feelings is a way to live more meaningfully and responsibly. When you take your experience into words, you create space for correction, for care, and for shared meaning. This is one of those practices that turns emotions from a secret power into a resource of mature human life. And Robert Solomon repeatedly returned his attention to this path. Emotional self-deception begins with a quiet divergence between what you tell yourself and what actually drives your actions. The problem is that this divergence is not merely a perceptual error. It restructures personal history so that your actions receive justification in the fictional version of motives. When the inner agreement with yourself weakens, both moral responsibility and the ability to live according to your own values become vulnerable. Worst of all, self-deception masks itself as rationality. The words sound convincing, fabrication is accepted as explanation, while the body continues to tell a different story. The criterion for recognizing such self-deception is neither mystical nor hidden behind complex psychology. It is simple. Consistency between word, bodily sensation, and recurring behavior. If your accounts of motives consistently diverge from how you feel and what you do, that is a reason to pay attention. A second criterion is the resilience of the story under external scrutiny. A narrative that changes depending on the listener more often serves as a saving legend than as a factual explanation. The third criterion is willingness to subject your version to doubt and accept alternative evidence about your own actions. A clear combination of these signs forms a diagnostic set that helps distinguish temporary self-comfort from systemic self-deception. The takeaway from this criteria is obvious. The further you deviate from the truth, the deeper the consequences. At the personal level, this leads to a split self. You live by story and by body simultaneously, and both layers begin to conflict. In relationships, this undermines trust without dramatic events. People feel the discrepancy even if they cannot name it. In professional life, self-deception distorts risk assessment, and decisions end up based not on facts, but on habitual excuses. At the level of practical ethics, persistent self-deception erodes the ability to take responsibility for one's actions, because responsibility requires accuracy in perceiving one's motives. Why does a person slide into self-deception? Motives are usually connected to the desire to preserve an intact self-image, to avoid pain, or to maintain status in a group. The psyche rationalizes choices to reduce internal conflict between desires and obligations. Cognitive mechanisms include selective attention, memory distortion, and the construction of causal chains in retrospect. Repeated rationalization cements false stories into thinking habits. It is important here to separate explaining causes from justifying actions. To explain the process is to understand the mechanism. To justify is to stop working on it. The mechanics of self-deception work by a simple algorithm. First, an unwanted desire or action arises. Then, consciousness searches for an excuse, after which a verbal story forms that aligns the behavior with self-esteem. If this cycle repeats, an automatic narrative forms that inhibits critical self-reflection. Consequences include loss of flexibility in evaluating new circumstances and reduced willingness to change. This triadic view of cause, structure, and consequences
helps understand why isolated interventions are useless. Change one node, and the whole system shifts. Robert Solomon, in his works, constructed emotions as judgments, and this approach gives a key to understanding self-deception. When an emotion is an appraisal of the world, a distortion of appraisal means a distortion of the emotion.
Robert Solomon insisted that acknowledging errors in appraisal is a moral act, because emotions fall within the domain of responsibility. Refusing to admit a divergence between inner feeling and narrative turns emotions into a vestige, severed from the practice of life decisions. Solomon's analysis suggests that the issue is not only correcting thoughts, but rebuilding the habit of appraising. The boundary you need to learn concerns the duration and functionality of self-deception. A temporary phase of diminishing defensive stories can serve as adaptation. A short period of consolation helps survive shock and preserve functioning. Chronic mode of excuses ceases to be adaptive when it damages long-term integrity of personality and harms others. Criteria for crossing the boundary include frequency of repetition, scale of harm caused, and loss of capacity to enter reflexive dialogue with others. When these markers are present, the strategy needs to change. Practical indicators you can use help determine whether self-deception has crossed the line. Watch for a feeling of fatigue from your own story, for the reaction of close ones who begin to avoid topics where the story repeats. Notice jumps in distance between what you say about values and how you respond in concrete situations. A signal is also refusal to accept feedback and inability to reproduce details of past explanations without clever inference. These signs mean that the story about yourself is living its own life and needs to be restructured. I turn to Robert Solomon's ideas when I speak about correction. He recommended not pursuing the ideal of insensitivity, but working on accuracy of appraisals through practice and social verification. The diagnostics and boundaries I mentioned are softened by regular practice of reflection, honest conversation with trusted people, and readiness to change the narrative if facts suggest a different order. This is a path not towards self-criticism for its own sake, but toward restoring concordance among words, feelings, and deeds. Forgiveness is structured as a sequential mechanism of changing appraisals, habits, and ties. First comes a revision of how you interpret the event. The grievance ceases to be a pure fact and becomes a meaningful construction that you can hold or change. Then speech comes into play. The words by which you give meaning to what happened shape access to further emotions. At the same time, bodily reactions operate. Holding on to anger keeps muscles tense. Releasing tension makes another reactivity possible. The final step is behavioral reconstruction of the relationship, where new interaction practices confirm the new appraisal. That whole sequence, cognitive, verbal, bodily, and behavioral alignment, is the mechanism of forgiveness. This mechanism is needed as a tool for restoring the fullness of human relationships. Forgiveness reduces the cumulative weight of past grievances because it translates energy from preserving anger into creating shared rules and habits. It allows people to continue collaborating when conflict would otherwise destroy joint projects. Forgiveness is more important for you than it seems because it frees attention and resources. Not so the event is forgotten or its significance disappears, but so the meaning of the past no longer dominates the possibilities of the future. Robert Solomon emphasized that emotions are appraisals, and therefore changing the appraisal really changes your moral landscape. Forgiveness performs the function of adjusting appraisals and so serves moral renewal. Where this mechanism breaks down, shows why forgiveness often remains a word without flesh. In the first breakdown, speech becomes ritual without content. The words "I forgive" can serve as a numbing agent for pain if they are not followed by bodily and behavioral change. Another breakdown is linked to sequence, attempting to move to relationship restoration before the harm is respected and the feeling clarified, creates a superficial accord that will soon crack. The mechanism breaks when there is no correspondence between acknowledgement of harm and acceptance of responsibility. It breaks in situations where power dictates forgiveness as a condition of survival, because then forgiveness ceases to be a meaningful act and becomes a forced gesture. Robert Solomon noted that emotions are subject to appraisals, and if the appraisal is imposed from outside, no internal restructuring will take place. A key failure also occurs at the level of repeatability. If behavior does not change, forgiveness becomes a loop. You say you have forgiven, and a new grievance confirms that no change has occurred. This cyclicity drains trust deeper than the initial complaint. Contexts where grievances are systematic, in families, at work, in institutions, are especially vulnerable here, because the mechanism of forgiveness counted on an individual ability to reorient. In a collective, external structures are needed to confirm new rules of interaction. Otherwise, personal forgiveness works like a bandage on a torn wound. A small life example will help feel the mechanism in motion. When a colleague acknowledges a mistake, utters words of regret, and then daily corrects their behavior, the tension between you subsides, words and actions converge, and trust is restored. If the words remain alone, tension increases, and the shared project loses its ground. The limits of forgiveness are also obvious. Not every forgiveness equals restoration of justice. When harm is so great that it requires systemic sanctions, forgiving one person does not remove the need to repair the damaged system. There are also temporal limits. Premature forgiveness will push unsatisfied needs into the shadows and undermine the autonomy of the injured. Moreover, forgiveness does not cancel the duty to learn from what happened and to introduce such changes in practice that make repetition impossible or unlikely. Robert Solomon emphasized that emotions are subject to moral work, and so forgiveness only makes sense when accompanied by practices of responsibility and behavioral change. The practical and ethical conclusion. Forgiveness is an active technology requiring discipline of words, body, and actions. If you want to try to forgive, start with recognizing concrete facts and your feelings. Say what mattered. Agree on small changes in interaction habits, and observe whether the body changes in the presence of the other. Watch whether the new mode of interaction holds longer than a single emotional wave. Robert Solomon helped me see that emotional appraisals can be trained, and that forgiveness is not elimination of memory, but reconstruction of meanings in which you keep your dignity while opening space for shared practical work. Forgiveness requires the courage to tell the truth and the patience to create new practices. Do it slowly, check the correspondence of words and actions, protect your autonomy, and do not take forgiveness for magic. When words, sensations, and behavior converge, relationships have a chance to be rebuilt. It is in that concordance that the power of forgiveness as a philosophical and practical life practice manifests. How does morality feel in the office? And can you produce a moral climate as systematically as you produce a production process? Emotions at work act as a continuous flow of appraisals that assign value to your actions, decisions, and expectations. Robert Solomon taught that feelings are not merely biological signals, but judgments about the value of what is happening. In an organizational setting, these judgments take the form of habits, spoken and tacit rules, formal policies, and daily rituals. When people label behavior unacceptable or praise a colleague's contribution, they are not merely describing, they are forming the emotional economy of the place, in which some reactions are encouraged and others are muted. This economy includes language, bodily practices, and institutional mechanisms that together create what is called corporate morality. How exactly emotions are translated into corporate culture is a question of mechanics. First, appraisals arise. Someone concludes that a risky decision is indecent. Someone else believes that courage deserves recognition. These appraisals find form in speech, in feedback patterns, in everyday comments. Speech cements norms because words give an occasion meaning and open the way to repetition. Then, habits and rituals consolidate the word in the body. Meetings proceed in a certain way. Congratulations and reprimands follow familiar scripts, and workers' bodies learn to respond in the same tones. Finally, rules and institutions, personnel policies, reward systems, procedural steps make practices reproducible. When all these layers are aligned, morality becomes a working tool for coordination and trust. Robert Solomon emphasized the link between speech and feelings. So, in an organization, changing language inevitably brings about a change in the emotional climate. What risks does an emotional culture carry? The reason for forming such a culture often lies in organizational pragmatics. You need to reduce conflict, increase productivity, retain people. The structure is formed through leaders, routines of communication, and formal policies. Consequences can be twofold. On the one hand, stable norms make collaboration easier, reduce uncertainty, and create a safe field for joint work. On the other hand, if norms rigidly fix acceptable emotional reactions or encourage treating emotions as a work task, authenticity and autonomy suffer. This analytical triad shows that one must look simultaneously at motivation, mechanisms, and consequences to understand when an emotional culture serves people and when it starts to use them. Professional emotionality often requires a certain labor. Emotional labor implies that you are expected to display calm, enthusiasm, or cool determination regardless of your inner state. This can enhance team competence and help clients feel heard. At the same time, emotional discipline without the person's participation turns experience into a performance. Robert Solomon spoke about feelings being formed through practice and speech. Therefore, the task of the organization is not to force people to play out stock emotions, but to create conditions in which sincere reactions find professional expression and support. How to work with the cult of emotions in practice if you want to change the moral field of a place. Pay attention to the language of communication, to rhythms of feedback, to formal procedures, and to bodily practices. Language should allow speaking about feelings without stigma, and procedures should show that emotions are taken into account in decisions. Training and supervision help develop emotional skills, but the key is regular practices, short retrospectives, rules of engagement in conflict, clear criteria for recognizing contribution. Leaders bear special responsibility through their example. Their ways of speaking and acting set the tone and show which emotions are considered workable. Robert Solomon reminded us that moral character is formed through repetition of practices. So organizations would do well to think of culture as a set of habits that can be refined. The boundaries of this approach must be set clearly. Emotional culture does not replace systemic justice. When problems are rooted in inequality, cold bureaucracy, or abuse of power, mere linguistic fixes and training will not fix the situation. You also must not turn emotional competence into an extra burden without recognition and support. Finally, personal autonomy must be preserved. Employees have the right to different emotional regimes and to protection from pressure to display a state they do not have. I believe Robert Solomon's philosophy helps keep this balance between personal responsibility and organizational care, because it treats feelings as practices susceptible to cultivation, thereby opening the way to making workplace morality a sustainable skill rather than a performance. Practically, this means combining institutional changes with daily supportive practices. Reliable complaint procedures and transparent promotion criteria are combined with a call of attentiveness to emotional state, regular check-ins, supervision, and the possibility to temporarily reduce load without stigma. It is also important to measure the moral climate, not only through satisfaction surveys, but by observing which emotions are rewarded and which punished, who gets airtime in meetings, how invisible emotional work is distributed. Managers benefit from learning reflection, acknowledging their own emotions, discussing dilemmas, and showing that moral mistakes are grounds for learning rather than for shame. If moral culture becomes part of management strategy, it requires resources, time, and honesty. Otherwise, transformations will be superficial. The ultimate goal is to create an environment where employees' emotional life is valued as a factor of both effectiveness and human dignity. This is labor that requires patience, a systemic approach, and constant feedback. When emotions harm, consequences arrive both gradually and suddenly. You lose clarity in decisions. What seemed urgent and necessary in the moment turns into a miscalculation because the appraisal of value was distorted. Erosion of trust appears in relationships. Repeated outbursts of resentment or chronic coldness push people away and make reality seem more dangerous than it is. In professional settings, persistent anxiety or aggression disrupt coordination, blur responsibility, and lead to the loss of collective goals. At the individual level, enduring negative emotions corrode autonomy. They form habitual reactions that you no longer choose consciously, but perform automatically. These consequences show up in three types of damage. First, cognitive distortion. An emotion changes the perception of facts and makes implausible conclusions attractive. Second, motivational breakdown. Emotions push you to act for short-term relief or revenge, undermining long-term projects. Third, social decay. Emotions stop being markers of value and turn into a habit that others begin to expect and respond to, reinforcing the vicious circle. These three effects often combine and amplify one another. The causes of such harm lie deeper than a momentary reaction. Emotions as evaluative judgments are formed in the context of habits, stories, and bodily routines. If your self-defining story revolves around rage or constant fear, the assessments of the world will align with that story. Neurobiology intensifies this dynamic. Stress changes activation thresholds, hormones slow down reasoning ability, and habitual responses are consolidated through repetition. Social mechanisms add fuel to the process. When the environment rewards expressiveness, or conversely punishes vulnerability, a set of acceptable emotions forms that people replicate and pass on. Institutional and narrative factors often sustain harmful emotions. Organizations and groups build expectations that make certain emotional responses advantageous. Media and cultural narratives fix archetypes that tell you whom to trust and how to react. Personal histories and professional roles intertwine, and then emotions become not only your private problem, but part of a mechanism that sustains the behavior of others. I notice that many people treat emotional explosions as sudden phenomena, whereas in fact, they are the result of a long series of reinforcements and narrative consolidations.
Clarifying the boundaries of harm is important so as not to confuse a normal emotion with pathology. An emotion causes harm when it regularly leads to decisions that contradict your own values, when it robs you of the ability to control your actions, or when it destroys relationships and opportunities you value. The criteria for recognition are simple: intensity, frequency, duration, and the scale of consequences. If a strong feeling passes quickly and does not change your choices, it can be considered adaptive. If, however, a feeling overwhelms you, repeats, and leads to destruction, that is a signal for intervention. Practical markers for recognition will help you act earlier. Note how the body reacts: tightness in the chest, loss of appetite, constant fatigue. Watch how your plans and habits change. Ask for honest feedback from someone you trust. Insert a pause between sensation and action, even a short one, to check whether the reaction aligns with your long-term goals. Developing the skill of slowing down is the first tool for switching strategy. It gives a chance to reassess the situation, change the interpretation, and choose an action consistent with your values. Switching strategies requires a systemic approach. Reframing the narrative helps. Searching for alternative explanations reduces the emotional volume of the event. Regular practices of self-observation and talking about feelings translate impulses into verbalizable judgments that are easier to change. Changing your environment and habits reduces the frequency of triggers. Training and regulation skills, such as breathing techniques, structured pauses, and planning responses, makes reactions less automatic. This work is needed both individually and in the community. Personal efforts without environmental support more often remain fragile. The connection of these ideas with the philosophy of Robert Solomon is clear and practical. If emotions are value judgments, harm arises from miscalibrated evaluations and from an environment that cements mistaken value scales. Robert Solomon insisted that feelings are formed through speech and practice, and therefore they can be redirected through altered language and stable habits. His thought allows us to think of harmful emotions not as a verdict, but as unlearned capacities that are subject to retraining. Applying Solomon's ideas, it is useful to build practices where emotions are discussed openly and without shame, where there are consistent rituals for recovery after emotional failures, where language describes values rather than only reactions. You can implement personal and collective rules that encourage reflection and provide resources for relearning. Robert Solomon suggests that the combination of speech, habit, and social feedback shifts emotional evaluations toward a more mature and controlled response. In the end, the task is clear. Recognize exactly how emotions distort your judgments. Understand their roots in history and environment, and build practices that change the value scale. Robert Solomon helps to see this as a process of character formation through repetition and conversation. When you learn to track the signs of harm and switch strategies, emotions will cease to be your enemy and become a tool that serves your aims and supports your choices. You are facing the decision to leave your job and feel that fear and shame are not merely accompanying the choice, but setting its tone. In that moment, fear narrows the range of possible actions, and shame whispers stories about who you will be in the eyes of others. This is a particular case where emotions act directly as conditions of freedom. They not only color the decision, they change its form and the space of possibilities. This is the basic idea. Emotions are not an obstacle to autonomy, but the way autonomy manifests. Feelings give significance to situations. They establish priorities. They show what truly matters to you. Robert Solomon emphasizes that emotions are evaluative judgments. When you feel interest, horror, or love, you are, in a sense, telling the world what matters to you. Autonomy in this sense is not an abstract right to choose, but the ability to formulate and defend your assessments amid a stream of real impulses and social expectations. Practically, this means that the freedom of decisions grows together with the ability to disentangle your emotions. If an emotion clarifies which values are at stake, it widens choice, because it makes motives and goals understandable. Robert Solomon proposes to regard feelings as forms of knowledge about one's life. Through fear, you learn about the boundaries of risk. Through attachment, about what you are willing to support. Emotional awareness turns an impulse into a signal from which a plan of action compatible with your story and projects can be constructed. It's also necessary to say something about the structure of this process. Cause, structure, and consequences work together. Biological reactions and cultural stories give rise to emotional evaluations. These evaluations form the interpretation of situations and the availability of actions. The result is either the strengthening of autonomy if the emotion informs and mobilizes, or its weakening if the emotion narrows perception and blocks reflection. Such an analysis shows why attention to emotions matters, not for their suppression, but for their understanding and formulation in speech and practice. There are boundaries you should keep in mind. Feelings lose their role as a basis for freedom when they become automatic reactions separated from reasoning and verbal description. Chronic anxiety, obsessive drives, or patterns of shame, reinforced by habits and environment, turn choice into an illusion because you act under the dictate of judgments that no longer pass through your conscious will. Robert Solomon shows that emotions support autonomy only if they are available for verbalization and critical reworking. There is a simple criterion that helps check whether an emotion serves you. If it expands horizons and provides information about values and risks, it is functional. If it narrows possibilities, pushes you to repeat the same decisions, and deprives you of the ability to reconsider your motivation, it limits autonomy. Assess intensity, recurrence, and connection with your stable values. Frequent and persistent reactions that contradict your long-term projects require intervention. What does such intervention look like in everyday terms? The transition from impulse to choice begins with speech about yourself and your experiences. Naming emotions reduces their power and makes planning possible. Robert Solomon points to the role of practice. The habit of voicing your assessments and discussing them with someone you trust restructures emotional scales. Rituals of appraisal, small deliberate pauses, and simple procedures for checking whether a decision aligns with values create space for autonomous choice. Environment is decisive. Emotions that support freedom require conditions where honesty about experiences is valued, where there is feedback, and where automatic repetition of defensive patterns is not rewarded. If the social environment rewards expressiveness without reflection or punishes vulnerability, your emotions quickly transform into coercive rules of behavior. Robert Solomon draws attention to the public aspect of forming feelings. Autonomy does not grow in a vacuum. It is nourished by the conversations and practices around you. One practical test is to ask yourself whether the current emotion expands your understanding of the situation or limits it. Think about what behavioral options it opens and which it blocks. If the answer leans toward blockage, insert a pause and articulate aloud at least one alternative that contradicts the initial impulse. This simple act shifts the emotion from a mode of automatic rule to a mode of substantive discussion. Finally, maintaining boundaries itself requires discipline and compassion. Autonomy does not mean dispassion. Being autonomous means acknowledging the depth of your experiences while having tools to process them. Robert Solomon shows that the practice of speech, habit, and collective support turns a feeling from a coercive mechanism into an informative resource you can use when making decisions. When emotions function this way, freedom becomes not an abstract ideal, but an everyday capacity to live in accordance with what truly matters to you. Practice begins small: a note in a journal, a short conversation with a friend, a pause before writing or calling. These small gestures build the muscle of reflection. Allowing yourself to name and discuss emotions teaches you to extract their constructive grain and separate it from automatic defensive reactions. Honesty with yourself is also important. Sometimes it is useful to acknowledge that an emotion does not serve your projects and to step back to regroup. In other cases, it is worth acting quickly but thoughtfully, relying on the information the emotion provided about your values. Thus, self-empathy and discipline of thought work together. The first allows you to accept the experience, the second, to direct it. Returning to the example of quitting a job, this means not simply following fear or shame, but voicing your concerns, weighing practical consequences, and choosing in alignment with long-term goals. This strengthens the meaning of life. Desire is a directed, evaluative striving toward what is perceived as good for life. Attachment is the incorporation of the person into an object or image such that they become part of its meaning. Desire orients you to possibility and project. It presupposes choice and calculation. Attachment creates a system of values that shapes your reactions and expectations. Robert Solomon describes these modes as different ways in which feelings are integrated into life. One supports movement, the other forms the constancy of identity. Why this distinction matters in practice. Causes, structure, and consequences help consider the problem systemically. Causes. Biology rewards obtaining the desired. Culture cements signs of value. And speech gives names to objects of longing. Structure. Repeated acts of desire turn into habits. Habits form scripts of behavior. Scripts compose stable roles. Consequences. If the process proceeds without reflection, freedom of choice shrinks. Evaluative scales become one-sided, and life loses adaptability. Such analysis shows why it is important to be able to recognize which stage you are at and what to do about it. How to see the difference in the moment when you experience an urge. Ask yourself what exactly drives you. The expectation of satisfaction and readiness to defer reward, or the feeling that without the object you lose your wholeness. If you see alternatives for action and are ready to adjust your course, it functions as desire. If choice seems impossible without preserving the status of the thing in your life, you are facing attachment. I often notice that the very act of formulating it aloud clarifies the situation more than long inner deliberation.
Tension arises where desire ceases to be an instrument and becomes a principle. This happens gradually. A repeated strategy of obtaining comfort is consolidated in speech. The environment confirms it as a norm, and fear of loss strengthens attachment. Robert Solomon points to the role of language in this transformation. The words you use to describe the object of your care turn it into part of your narrative about yourself. The narrative about the relationship cements the pattern, and then desire no longer regulates behavior. Instead, expected reactions from others and an internal need to be someone who preserves the object do. How this breaks practical freedom. The focus shifts from evaluating possibilities to protecting the status of things, to managing losses. You begin to act out of fear of change or out of the need to sustain an image, rather than out of calculation aligned with long-term goals. This generates emotional instability and irrational decisions because criteria of value stop being updated. Robert Solomon emphasizes that such stagnation of feelings reduces moral responsibility. When attachment dictates actions, choice is made by inertia rather than by meaning. What to do in practical life to preserve the mobility of desire while respecting attachments that truly nourish you? The rule is simple. Translate the experience into speech and temporary tests. Naming the state and voicing alternatives reduces emotional rigidity. Temporary trials, short pauses, and agreements with yourself provide space to test value. Structures of speech and rituals of appraisal restructure habitual scales of significance and return you to the role of evaluator rather than guardian of status. How to check the effectiveness of the practice? Pay attention to the range of possible actions and to the ability to revise a stable goal. If, after speaking out and pausing, at least one viable alternative appears, it is a sign that you are back in desire mode. If all considered options return you to the single reaction, attachment remains strong. Such a check gives a concrete criterion for intervention without moral reproach and without self-flagellation. Working with the environment strengthens personal practice. In conversations with those you trust, you can ask not only for support, but for the question, what is really important to you? Discussing values and goals brings the relationship into the public domain of appraisal and makes attachment accountable to reasoning. Robert Solomon notes the significance of social practices in forming feelings. Collective speech disciplines the tendency toward automatic consolidations and at the same time provides space for sincerity. Finally, the aim is not to eliminate attachments as such. Attachment serves as the support of life, forming loyalty and responsibility. It is sensible to cultivate attachments that feed projects and do not block revision. Desire provides flexibility and the discovery of the new. By combining the discipline of speech, temporal experiments, and honest feedback, you turn any biased impulse into information about what you truly want. Robert Solomon proposes to see emotions as a life technology. With them, you can both love deeply and choose freely. Practice can include several simple exercises. The first, 3 reasons, 3 losses, 3 opportunities. The second, a week without the habit and recording sensations. The third, prioritization. What supports the project and what preserves the image. These are simple tests, but they discipline speech and create space for reconsideration. It is also important to learn to tolerate small losses. This trains the ability to let go and choose again. The social field can support this practice. Ask friends to pose questions that move the conversation from a defensive role to an investigative one. Such openness reduces the cost of deceiving yourself and allows you to remain faithful to projects without turning them into prisons of image.
If practiced consciously, attachments remain a source of strength rather than a cause of stagnant behavior. Our task is to learn to sustain closeness without turning it into a monolith, and to retain the capacity to choose. Then love remains a place of strength, and desire an instrument of growth. Practice requires patience. Try, measure the result, and adjust expectations. Over time, you will see which attachments nourish and which drain. Philosophy is often presented as a set of abstract theories, a subject for reading and discussion, an academic discipline. Something else is more important. Philosophy is a set of practices that shape a way of life, habits of thought and feeling. Robert Solomon proposed looking at philosophy as a technique of existence, and this shift changes the focus from correct propositions to correct actions. Practice is not simply repeating ideas. It is structured activity that becomes embodied in speech and body. Habit, ritual, a conversation with yourself or others, these are all ways to cement meaning. When you regularly direct attention and put choices into words, evaluative judgments become available not only as thoughts, but as ways of responding. Such a transition transforms an abstract norm into a working support. How do ideas become stable practices? First comes intention, then repetition, then external checking. Intention remains fragile until it takes the form of action. Repetition makes action predictable, and predictability allows assessing consequences. I have seen this many times. A short procedure introduced into a routine eventually changes how a person perceives a situation and which decisions they consider permissible. The mechanics are simple and at the same time subtle. Speech records experience and names it. The environment confirms or contests the new behavior, and the body responds by decreasing or increasing anxiety. Robert Solomon drew attention to the fact that words create feeling habits. What is spoken turns into a routine of reaction. The interplay of language, the social field, and bodily memory forms the framework of practice. Brief conclusion. Practice needs form. Without words, place, and time, the idea remains decoration. Acquired form sets the condition for transforming inner respect for an idea into stable behavior. The reason for this necessity is that the mind tends to economize energy. The structure of the process looks like this. An idea meets the barrier of habit. A word forms a rule. Repetition embeds the rule in behavior. The consequences are obvious. If you skip stages, the practice crumbles. If you follow them, changes become reliable. This analysis helps understand where good intentions break and what is needed to restore them. Emotions play a key role in this. They do not impede practice. They become its fuel if you learn to direct them. Training the emotions is not their suppression, but the ability to bring them into the rhythm of action. Robert Solomon showed how to develop emotional virtue through repeatable practices. If an emotion accompanies an action according to a pattern, it gradually ceases to be spontaneous and becomes an instrument of evaluation. Imagine philosophy as a toolkit, each tool guided not only by meaning, but by movement. One tool teaches slowing down a reaction, another, voicing values aloud, a third, prioritizing projects. The image helps catch that philosophy is not a set of rules, but an arsenal of techniques from which you pick what fits your life. The point of this approach is that practices have limits. They do not transform a person instantly, do not cancel context, and do not guarantee absolute truth. Practice improves the ability to evaluate and act, but it requires time, honesty, and a willingness to adjust. You cannot expect a universal recipe. What nourishes one person will be unsuitable for another. Integration of practice into everyday life is achieved through rituals of time and speech, through an agreement with your surroundings, and through automation of particular steps. You put an element into the schedule, name it, and ask for feedback. Thus, an external framework is formed that helps internal change take root. Robert Solomon pointed to the social side of such practices. Public speech and collective confirmation make individual discipline more stable. Limits remain important. Practice should not become a form of self-repression or a way to avoid responsibility. It affects freedom of choice when it helps you be more mindful, not when it turns into dogma. Watch that regularity serves flexibility and that habits remain under the control of reasoning. Fixation. Philosophy as practice requires three things: language, repetition, and external checking. The word gives form, repetition implants the reaction into the body, and feedback verifies value. Robert Solomon proposed treating these elements as everyday tools for turning thoughts into a way of life. If you want ideas to work, make habits for them. Measure the changes and stay ready to revise what stops working. Then philosophy will become not what you read, but who you live as. Philosophy is often presented as a set of abstract theories, a subject for reading and discussion, an academic discipline. More important is another view. Philosophy is a set of practices that shape a way of life, habits of thought and feeling. Robert Solomon suggested looking at philosophy as a technique of existence, and this shift changes the focus from correct propositions to correct actions. Practice is not just repeating ideas, it is structured activity that moves into the body and speech. Habit, ritual, a conversation with yourself or with others, all are ways to fix meaning. When you regularly direct attention and verbalize a choice, evaluative judgments become available not only as a thought, but as a way of responding. Such a transition transforms an abstract norm into a working support. How do ideas become stable practices? First comes intention, then repetition, then external checking. Intention remains fragile until it takes the form of action. Repetition makes action predictable, and predictability allows evaluation of consequences. I have seen it many times. A short procedure introduced into a routine over time changes how a person perceives a situation and what decisions they consider permissible. The mechanics are simple and at the same time subtle. Speech fixes the experience and gives it a name. The environment confirms or disputes the new behavior, and the body responds through a decrease or increase of anxiety. Robert Solomon drew attention to the fact that words create habits of feeling. What is spoken turns into a routine of reaction. The interconnection of language, the social field, and bodily memory forms the framework of practice. Brief conclusion. Practice needs form. Without words, place, and time, an idea remains decoration. Acquired form sets the condition for transforming internal respect for an idea into stable behavior.
The reason for this necessity is that the mind tends to conserve energy. The process looks like this. An idea meets the barriers of habit. A word forms a rule. Repetition implants the rule into behavior. The consequences are obvious. If you skip stages, practice falls apart. And if you follow them, changes become reliable.
This analysis helps understand exactly where good intentions break and what is required to restore them. Emotions play a key role in this. They do not hinder practice, but become its fuel if you learn to direct them. Training the emotions is not their suppression, but the ability to bring them into the rhythm of action. Robert Solomon showed how to develop emotional virtue through repeatable practices. If an emotion accompanies an action according to a pattern, it gradually ceases to be spontaneous and becomes an instrument of evaluation. Imagine philosophy as a toolkit, each tool guided not only by meaning but by movement. One tool teaches slowing down a reaction, another, voicing values aloud, a third, prioritizing projects. The image helps catch that philosophy is not a set of rules, but an arsenal of techniques from which you pick what fits your life. The point of this approach is that practices have limits. They do not transform a person instantly, do not cancel context, and do not guarantee absolute truth. Practice improves the ability to evaluate and act, but it requires time, honesty, and a willingness to adjust. You cannot expect a universal recipe. What nourishes one person will be unsuitable for another. Integration of practice into everyday life is achieved through rituals of time and speech, through an agreement with your surroundings, and through automation of particular steps. You put an element into the schedule, name it, and ask for feedback. Thus, an external framework is formed that helps internal change take root. Robert Solomon pointed to the social side of such practices. Public speech and collective confirmation make individual discipline more stable. Limits remain important. Practice should not become a form of self-repression or a way to avoid responsibility. It affects freedom of choice when it helps you be more mindful, not when it turns into dogma. Watch that regularity serves flexibility and that habits remain under the control of reasoning. Fixation. Philosophy as practice requires three things: language, repetition, and external checking. The word gives form, repetition implants the reaction into the body, and feedback verifies value. Robert Solomon proposed treating these elements as everyday tools for turning thoughts into a way of life. If you want ideas to work, make habits for them, measure the changes, and stay ready to revise what stops working. Then, philosophy will become not what you read, but who you live as. Practical philosophy, in fact, requires one more component: patience with the non-ideal nature of the process. This. Mistakes become material for learning if they are accepted and analyzed, not hidden. And growth awaits. Another key point: linking practice to concrete goals, measurable and connected to life. For now, plan a step so that it is simple, takes little time, and does not break other plans. And this is doable. Keeping a simple practice journal, 3 lines a day, helps see dynamics and move forward. Yes, specify time and place. This will reduce inertia and help start without unnecessary excuses. And repeat. Yes. Give yourself permission for smallness. Often a small victory starts self-trust and expands the field of the possible. It is important to record the emotions that appear during execution and note changes in them. Mark the type of response and its intensity. Over time, many responses become more compliant. This is not a renunciation of demandingness. Self-respect and clarity restrain weak self-indulgence. And try. Small steps and regularity produce an incredible effect.
After months, everything changes. This is a matter of habit. By creating space for attempts and errors, you protect your attention and create conditions for growth. In the end, philosophy as practice is life with intention. Small, honest steps repeated daily. And public emotions constitute a powerful mechanism for forming norms and political decisions. They set the scale of what is considered important, worthy of attention, and deserving of a response. Emotions in the public sphere do not merely express individual experiences. They act as a collective evaluation that is translated into practices, rules, and institutions. An expanded explanation of this process shows that an emotion works as both a signal and an argument at the same time. A signal because the expression of anger, admiration, grief, or shame attracts attention, mobilizes people, and organizes interaction. An argument because an emotional reaction carries an evaluative judgment. It asserts value or harm, makes visible what matters. Language and imagery amplify this effect. Phrases, memes, metaphors, and public rituals turn individual experiences into collective stories. When you see a crowd applauding or the public responding to a speech, you observe the operation of an evaluative judgment that becomes a norm. The mechanism engages three levels. At the individual level, emotions facilitate quick coordination of actions. At the interpersonal level, they create expectations and standards of behavior. At the institutional level, expressed feelings are entrenched in rules, practices, and the reputations of organizations and leaders. Public rage can lead to an investigation, collective joy to recognition of merits, mass grief to policy review. All these processes are amplified when a community has available repertoires of speech and ritual that translate emotion into a form understandable to others. The boundary of applicability of this idea requires clarity. Emotions form norms when they are subject to articulation and critical discussion, and lose regulatory value when they become a means of manipulation or a constant background of extreme reactions. Criteria for the effectiveness of public emotions can be named as follows: transparency of sources and reasons for the feeling, the possibility of fact-checking, the capacity of the emotional practice to be responsive and reversible. When these conditions work, public emotion acts as a mechanism of correction and solidarity. When sources are hidden, when emotion supports disinformation or is used for intimidation, it becomes an instrument of power rather than collective morality. A small example illustrates this limit. After a mourning ceremony, public attention can support a bill if the collected experiences are translated into concrete demands and institutional steps. Without this, the mourning remains a feeling but does not become a regulator of behavior. Robert Solomon suggested viewing emotions as evaluative judgments that gain force in public practice. His view helps understand why public feelings have political value. He showed that emotions form meaning through speech and action, and that is why collective expression of emotions can become a foundation for law and public affairs. Solomon emphasized that the language of experience is not merely metaphor. It is a means of producing norms. When people jointly name an event injustice or tragedy, they set the boundaries for further action. In this sense, the work of public life is connected with the education and articulation of feelings, not only with the creation of procedures. The practical conclusion that aligns with Solomon is that society can improve the quality of its decisions through a culture of emotional speech and institutions of accountability. Skills must be developed that allow expressing feelings clearly, verifiably, and with regard for consequences. This includes expanding the vocabulary of experiences, creating venues for dialogue, fact-checking mechanisms, and protocols that allow transforming collective reaction into institutional changes.
Robert Solomon also emphasized the necessity of cultivating emotional virtue. When people learn to recognize and formulate their feelings, public life becomes less susceptible to spontaneous manipulation and more capable of moral self-regulation. The final thought links this topic to the larger picture of the philosophy of emotions. Public feelings are a resource for politics and moral organization, but they work well only under conditions of transparent speech, collective reflection, and institutional feedback. If you want public experiences to bring constructive change, pay attention to how they are named, who shapes them, and what practical steps follow from their expression. Robert Solomon teaches that emotions are not only what you feel alone, they are a way of living together, and how society cultivates and directs its feelings determines how its norms and policies will be arranged. In this context, not only theoretical awareness is important, but concrete practice. Education should include emotional literacy, the ability to recognize the motives of one's own reaction, analyze information sources, and consider the consequences of public expression. Media and platforms are obliged to create conditions for responsible articulation, moderation, transparent rules, and opportunities for rebuttal and contextualization. Political institutions can implement procedures that translate public experiences into verifiable demands. Hearings, expert commissions, public consultations, regulated channels for appeals. Civil society bears responsibility for maintaining rhetoric that does not degrade into emotion hunting for traffic. Activists and opinion leaders should demonstrate readiness to adjust strategies in response to new facts. Finally, it is important to retain recognition of the dual nature of emotions. They are a source of motivation and meaning, but also a vulnerable field of manipulation. Practical wisdom requires a combination of feeling and reason, rhetoric and procedures, empathy and verification. Only in this way can public emotions remain an instrument of solidarity and moral regulation, not a tool of polarization and control. This requires time, reforms, and honest public work. Dialogue, fact-checking, accountability, and respect for truth. Conditions of maturity of public feelings. It is everyone's duty. The problem is that aesthetic experience is more often perceived as a private state of pleasure or taste, and excluded from the ways of knowing. In academic and practical life, verbal evidence, statistics, and formal arguments prevail, while artistic experience is considered a subjective illusion. As a result, access is lost to that kind of understanding that concerns human meaning, values, and motivations in their dense, bodily, and narrative form. When art and aesthetics are outside the epistemic domain, public language loses the richness of images that help people make sense of suffering, joy, devotion, and loss. The criterion by which an aesthetic experience can be considered knowledge should include several conditions. First, it must be productive. It must change modes of perception and evaluation so that this affects actions and decisions. Second, it must be verifiable through intersubjective communication. An account of the experience, an image, music, or a painting should elicit concordant responses from other people or be subject to critique and revision. Third, the aesthetic representation must have a structure that allows one to distinguish causal or meaningful connections within the experience, even if these connections are expressed metaphorically. Fourth, it is important that the experience contribute to integrating feeling and reason. That is, it can be made sense of and discussed outside the specific moment of emotion. These criteria provide a way to distinguish deep aesthetic insights from fleeting impressions, and form a standard for including art in the system of knowledge. If aesthetic experience is recognized as a kind of knowledge according to these criteria, the consequences will be broad and practically tangible. In education, the emphasis will shift toward teaching how to read and formulate experience, not only how to analyze texts or compute models. This means schools and universities will begin to value practices that develop attentiveness to form, empathy, and the ability to transfer artistic meanings into everyday speech. In ethics and practical life philosophy, they will appear a tool for recognizing moral subtleties. An artistic image can capture a conflict of values and show why a certain action wounds or heals, where statistics do good and where formal norms are powerless. In professional life, the culture of decision-making will be enriched by additional evaluation criteria. Not only efficiency, but also aesthetic reflection on the quality of relationships and the meaning of work. This also changes the role of feelings in forming public memory and identity. When works of art and aesthetic practices take part in public discourse, they create collective frames for understanding tragedies and achievements, form a language of empathy and of the embodiment of fates. Such work with meaning influences political narratives, because politicians and public institutions that take aesthetic density of experience into account can offer symbols and rituals that help integrate conflict into the common fabric of life, rather than reduce it to resolutions and laws. Practical therapy and care for vulnerable people benefit from recognizing aesthetic ways of knowing. Music, image, performance, and visual practices open access to experiences that are difficult to express in words. This is not a replacement for speech, but another channel of understanding that allows remembering, living through, and reinterpreting experiences. In the context of professional ethics for doctors, social workers, and educators, aesthetic perception helps see the person as a whole, not as a set of symptoms or tasks. In public life, this means a greater readiness for care that relies not only on protocols, but on the ability to hear and acknowledge subtle meanings of experience. Reassessing aesthetics affects the culture of argumentation and public dialogue. Arguments enhanced by an artistic image acquire a force field that makes moral intentions and side effects of actions visible. This gives the possibility of deeper critique of institutions and practices, because artistic representation often uncovers hidden premises and consequences that do not fit standard analytical schemes. In media and public communication, increasing the role of aesthetic knowledge requires developing skills of responsibility for the form of presentation, for symbolism, and for the emotions transmitted to the audience. The analytical triad shows how this works in practice. The cause, a lack of languages for expressing moral complexities. The mechanism, artistic form provides metaphors, narrative configurations, and bodily experiences. The consequences, an expansion of collective understanding, changes in practices, and institutional response to new, meaningful demands. Such a scheme justifies including aesthetics in the toolkit of public rationality and explains why creativity can be a source of social innovations and moral maturity. The boundary of application of aesthetic knowledge requires clear recognition of its limits. Aesthetic experience does not replace logical evidence and empirical verification in areas where precision and reproducibility are required. Artistic representation can distort, be manipulative, appeal to feelings for effect rather than understanding. Therefore, aesthetic knowledge needs institutions of critique and educational practices that teach how to distinguish deep insight from a rhetorical trick. Moreover, it operates through the interpretation and translation of experiences into a language of action. Without such translations, aesthetics remains a private resource, valuable, but insufficiently influential. Robert Solomon insisted that emotions and aesthetics give form to the formation of meaning and evaluation, rather than merely coloring experience. His thought helps explain why artistic experience deserves an epistemic status, because it shapes judgments of value and gives form to griefs, joys, and loyalties. Solomon also emphasized the role of language and practice in cultivating feelings, which means that aesthetics as knowledge requires collective ways of learning and testing. Incorporating such practices into public life makes public discourse richer and more capable of empathy and appropriate response. The final point is this: if you are willing to accept that art and aesthetic experience can be sources of understanding human meaning, you should work on criteria for trusting that knowledge, develop institutions of criticism, and translate experience into action. Robert Solomon shows a path by which feelings, form, and speech turn into practical wisdom. This will not eliminate the need for facts and reason, but it will give society additional tools for constructing meaning and care that cannot be obtained through formal evidence alone. When you feel anxiety about death, it is not merely an unpleasant experience. It is a signal about the values that actually matter to you. The finitude of time gives particular tasks and relationships weight. It turns projects into promises and promises into obligations. Emotions, in Solomon's understanding, are not random flashes, but evaluations of the world that communicate what deserves your attention. Anxiety and fear of death act as criteria of importance. They show where your beliefs diverge from how you live, and where you need to decide on the direction of your efforts. The mechanism of this connection is simple, and at the same time, deep. A future that seems uncertain and finite measures the value of the present. When you realize you have less time, choices acquire a context that was previously hidden by routine. This makes not only great deeds, but also small practices significant. Speech and habits become a way to prolong meaning, a way to tell the world and yourself that what you are doing has continuity and leaves a trace. Love in such a world is a skill cultivated through repetition, through language of commitment, and through rituals of care. Anxiety mobilizes the formation of these disciplines. It motivates learning to speak about important things, building connections, and keeping promises. This dynamic has a social and political aspect. Collectives that have ignored mortality as a factor in meaning-making tend to lose the symbolic forms that bind individuals to one another. When a society creates practices of memory, rituals of farewell, and artistic images, it supplies individuals with a language by which emotions become shared. Aesthetic experiences allow losses and victories to be marked in ways that influence collective behavior. In such conditions, anxiety ceases to be destructive and becomes a resource for collective work to preserve and improve the world that you and others will pass on. At the same time, there are limits and distortions in using anxiety as motivation. Chronic anxiety exhausts the capacity to act and narrows the field of the possible, turning choice into a rigid reaction. Fear of death can generate a search for total control, which leads to the suppression of others and to an exaggerated defense of the group's interests. The opposite extreme is also possible, when awareness of finitude leads to cynical neglect of obligations and to selfish consumption. Both phenomena, narrowing one's stance in life and instrumentalizing others, serve as indicators of distortion. The criterion for the suitability of anxiety as a guide is whether it preserves openness to dialogue, the capacity to change practices, and the willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of one's decisions.
Practical techniques that allow working productively with anxiety rely on repetition, on speech, and on collective forms. Regular rituals of farewell and acknowledgement help integrate loss into the narrative of life. Open conversations about priorities and obligations reduce vague anxiety and make it a guide for joint action. Artistic practices provide a language for complex feelings and ease their translation into moral decisions. Stoic discipline of thought and emotional training reduce vulnerability to panic while preserving the ability to be moved by feeling. These strategies work together. They turn fear into the engine of moral practice rather than a source of aggression. The role of personal responsibility in this context is hard to overestimate.
A mindful attitude toward the finitude of time implies not fleeing from choice, but readiness for limits. Autonomy manifests in the ability to choose a framework for your life, accept conditions, and act within them with care for others. Emotional honesty helps to recognize which projects you truly care about and to separate them from fashionable or imposed goals. In this sense, anxiety becomes an indicator of the obligations that deserve energy and time, and, at the same time, of those that require letting go. The connection between fear of death and aesthetic knowledge deserves special attention. Artistic experience helps soften the gap between the fact of finitude and the desire for permanence. Through image, music, and narrative, one can hold on to the meaning of what was experienced, making it available for exchange and transformation. This is not a magical elimination of death. It is a way of embedding finitude into the fabric of life so that it communicates meaning, not only the bitterness of loss. Solomon saw in art a means that possesses epistemic force. It forms a judgment about value and thereby produces practical wisdom. The boundary of application of these ideas appears in areas where precision of measurement and reproducibility are required. In scientific and technical tasks, anxiety as an evaluation does not replace empirical evidence. Where the safety of many people is at stake, emotions must be given form through institutions and rules that minimize the arbitrary influence of fear. Another boundary is psychological vulnerability. Some people experience such levels of anxiety that without professional help, they turn their reactions into self-destruction. It is important to give anxiety the role of an informant, not of fate, and to create conditions for its interpretation and redirection. Key thoughts can be stated briefly and together. Awareness of finitude makes choices meaningful and directs practices. Anxiety functions as an evaluative judgment, prompting the formation of habits and promises. Rituals, speech, and art translate fear into collective meaning and into action. Distortions occur when fear closes off possibilities for dialogue or becomes a search for total control. Personal responsibility and emotional honesty enable using anxiety as a resource for a constructive life. These pillars help tie individual strands of thought into a single philosophy of feeling, in which finitude serves as a source of meaning. I propose accepting your sense of vulnerability as an invitation to the discipline of love, to the rhetoric of promises, and to the practice of farewell. Create simple rituals, speak about what truly matters, embed artistic forms into communication, develop the ability to translate anxiety into a structure of commitments and care. Then the finitude of time will cease to be only a burden and will become working material for creating a life with transparent priorities, with a sense of duty to yourself and to others, and with the ability to preserve the memory of what mattered. Good night.